here today to talk with these lovely ladies about my life and my family, and to have tea with them. Would you like to pour the tea, please? Thank you very much. It's so nice to have you here today in this beautiful home that once was mine, but no longer is. The present owners were kind enough to ask me here today so that I could have tea once again in this house and be with my friends. As I sit here and I look at these walls, they bring back memories. They just keep flooding into my mind. And some of those memories were very happy, and some were very sad. The story of my family, for me, begins with my grandfather, Martin Murphy. He was born in Ireland in the late 1700s, and he was a large, handsome man, very robust, thank you, and he was looking for religious and political freedom. He left Ireland as a young man and moved to Canada, and then to Missouri, and then Iowa. And from there, he decided to join a wagon train and come to California with his 8 children. My grandmother, unfortunately, had passed on a few years before. But they joined this wagon train and they came across rugged terrain. They actually came through what we call Donner Pass now, in honor of those poor unfortunate people who didn't make it through the pass successfully. A couple of years after, my grandfather and his wagon train did make it through, and I'm so sorry for those people, but I'm glad my grandfather was able to get through. And they had an interesting story to tell about getting across that terrain. They used an ingenious thing called pulleys, and they pulled the animals and the carts up through these rocks and boulders and all the obstacles they met. And so they were able to get across that rugged terrain and make it safely to California. And so in the 1840s, my grandfather came here to this area, and he bought land from a man named Juan Hernandez. He bought a considerable amount of land, and it was right over here, just a short ways from here, under a peak that's now called El Toro. But at that time, they called it Murphy's Peak because my grandfather used to ride up that peak and go to the top and look down and gaze over all of the acres that he owned. He built a home on that property, and he also built a church, which is still standing, although they moved it to San Martin, and it now serves as the San Martin Presbyterian Church. And I think that's wonderful. My grandfather had 8 wonderful children, but the most remarkable one was my daddy, Daniel Murphy. He was known for all of his amazing achievements. When he was young, he fought with Fremont against the Mexicans. He went to the gold rush during the gold rush fever. He mined for a short time, but he actually made money when he opened a store and sold goods to the miners. My daddy knew how to make money. He always made money. Everything he touched turned to gold, kind of like the Midas touch, I believe they call it. And my daddy learned ranching on grandfather's ranch. And that's where he gathered all of his business savvy, which later made him a very rich man. He used that to good advantage. He had so many ventures. He owned horses and cattle, and he also had a vineyard he planted. He had a sawmill, and he raised grain. He even helped build a little railroad that went from Santa Clara to San Jose, and he put money in a little electric company, which was just starting back then, and now I believe it's called PG&E. He was just amazing. He also served in government, Among other things, he was served on the Santa Clara County Board of Supervisors, no less. And then he married my mother. He met my mother. He married her when she was only 15. Her name was Maria Fisher, and she was a beauty. And they made a very handsome couple. They had actually 6 children, but only 3 of us lived to adulthood, my brother, my sister, and I. And I remember my early years. I was born on the San Martin Ranch, and they were very happy, as I recall, playing with my brother and sister. And then later, as I grew, everyone commented on my beauty with my violet eyes and my then dark hair. And then finally, I got to early adulthood, and I went to college up in San Jose at Notre Dame College. There, some of my classmates called me the Duchess of Durango. I suppose they meant it in derisive terms, but I didn't mind. I rather liked it. Duchess. It suited me. One thing I didn't inherit from my daddy, although I was his favorite, he doted on me, but I didn't inherit a love of the land. I liked city life, where there were important people to meet, and there were exciting things happening, and parties to go to. And so I spent as much time as possible in San Francisco. And while I was in San Francisco, in the social set, I met Morgan. I had many suitors, understand, but none suited me until I met Morgan, and I fell in love. He was so handsome and tall. I was so smitten. He was over 6 feet tall, and he drove a carriage with 2 matching horses pulling the carriage. Oh, he was so stylish. He originally came from a little town in Missouri called Cape Girardeau, I think it's pronounced, and he lived there with his grandparents who raised him. And then there was a scandal, they said, attached with Morgan, having something to do with a cousin of his. And so his grandparents told him that he had to leave. He had to get out of town. And so he came to California with his sister. I can't believe that a man as stylish as Morgan would have been involved in something like that. But that was the past. Anyway, Morgan and I fell in love, and we were so in love. We were secretly married. We didn't tell anyone. We were so happy. But then, shortly after that, I received news that my father was gravely ill. And he had never approved of Morgan. But I raced to his side, and as I sat there holding his hand, he said to me, "You must make me a promise that you'll never marry Morgan." And I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to say. My father was dying. And so I said, "All right, Daddy, I promise." And then he died shortly after. And I thought, oh, what have I done? I made a promise that's impossible. I was devastated. I didn't know what to do or where to turn. I thought, well, maybe I should divorce Morgan. So I started proceedings. But friends intervened, and they got us back together. And we went to Paris, and we had a belated honeymoon, and it was a very good, healing time. And we got back together. And then when we came back from Paris, in 1884, we built this beautiful home, Villa Miramonte. And also, in the same year, far more exciting, we had our daughter Diane born to us. She was absolutely gorgeous, Diane. And along with my plans for the house, I began to make plans for Diane, and nothing would stand in my way. I saw to it that Diane was well educated in the finest schools I could find. She spoke 3 languages fluently. She was a beauty, very fragile, but I wanted her to travel in social sets and marry a man of wealth and of good social standing. She once told me she wanted to marry an honest farmer instead of an aristocrat. Can you believe that? But I wouldn't hear of that. So at 18, she made her debut, and she was quite lovely, and she continued to go to all the proper parties and meet important people. And then when she was 27, she married Baron Hardoun de Renacworth from France. And they had a beautiful wedding. Unfortunately, it was very small. Only Morgan and I attended. But I saw to it that a proper article was placed in the Washington Post telling of their marriage. And they had plans to stay in Europe for a while and then travel to Canada and then the United States. And then poor Diane, we heard about her daddy who was gravely ill and had suffered a stroke. And Diane just became beside herself, and she was so anguished and so saddened that we had to put her in a sanitarium in England to recover. And she had suffered from sadness from time to time, but now she was in deep anguish. And for some unknown reason, while she was there, she jumped out of the window on the second story and landed on rocks below. My poor Diane, she killed herself. She was so beautiful, but she was frail and sensitive. Morgan and I had adopted her husband, the Baron, as our son. He was family after all. So he and I made arrangements to go to Morgan's side and to nurse him back to health. But Morgan didn't make it. He died soon after that. And we grieved for him and for Diane. But after a time, the Baron and I began having parties and going out socially again. And we moved to the Elko Miramonte, a beautiful house I had built in Elko, Nevada. It was a 2-story house with a beautiful view. And while we were there, the Baron they called him Captain Worth. He was very well accepted because he was quite a dashing man, and he was a man's man. And so we had many parties and invited many people in. Some people said that it was scandalous that we lived together like that. But I didn't care. I loved parties and I loved our life. So we entertained and we had a wonderful time. And then that wretched World War II came along, and Hardoun was called back to duty. And he went to Washington, D.C., I heard, as an interpreter, and then later, I think, to Canada and then to Paris. And I heard he married an actress or something like that. I don't know. No one ever saw him again. And then for a time, I was really beside myself. I didn't know what to do. After all, I'd lost my mother and father, my brother and sister, my husband, my daughter, and in a way, Hardoun. I had no one to turn to. I had no one to lavish affection on. I did have 2 little Pomeranian dogs. I was able to lavish some affection on them. But then I began to entertain and go to parties frequently. And eventually, I tired of the life here, and I began selling my properties. And so I moved to London. And when I got to London, I quickly got into the social set there. Oh, and there were so many wonderful and important people to meet. At that time, I was presented to the king. That was really exciting. And then I met George, the darling man, and we were married soon after. I became Lady Diana Murphy Morgan Hill Rhodes because George was a lord in England. We were very happy. We had a good marriage. But George died. We only had a 2-year marriage, and it was very sad to lose him. And And I stayed on in the social set. I continued to travel in Europe, and I developed a taste for gaming, and I frequented Monte Carlo and went to the gaming tables there. It's pretty exciting. I began to sell a lot of my properties, and but I kept going back to Monte Carlo to play the gaming tables and visit with friends. Oh, as I look at the time, I'm so glad that you were able to come today, but I'm afraid I'm going to have to bid you farewell for now. I have an appointment. I have to get to San Francisco. I'm going to an engagement there, and then on to Europe from there. Thank you so much for coming, and so now I'll bid you adieu for now. Thank you.